Welcome back for our deep dive discussion into poetry. Last month we discussed rhyming, which forces poets to focus on how syllable and word sounds within the structure of their poetic lines. We also discussed the 6 types of rhyme schemes that are commonly used when writing this form of poetry. This month we are going to discuss lyrical poetry, which often goes hand in hand with rhyming poetry. Lyrical poetry, like odes, gets its history from ancient Greece. These were song-like poems written specifically to the stringed instrument known as the lyre.
Liar!
Whoa, do you smell burning? Oh crap, my pants! Ah! Guys, you know what? I have told you before, stop letting pyromaniacs into the studio, okay? Sheesh. Anyway, it is from the from that instrument that we get the term lyrical. Many modern songs take stylistic inspiration from those older forms. Lyrical poetry, in the modern sense, however, focuses on expressing personal emotions and feelings, typically spoken in the first person perspective. But before we can jump into writing lyrical poetry, we need to understand a new term, and that is meter. No, I don't mean the metric system. I mean meter, which is the basic rhyming structure of a verse or line in a poem. The meter of a poem focuses on the number of syllables in a line and how they are stressed or not. The most common meters used in lyrical poetry are iambic, trochaic, pyrrhic, anapestic, dactylic, and spondaic. Yes, they are real words. Let me explain. Iambic meter includes 2 syllables, the first one being unstressed while the second is stressed. For example, the word above. The first syllable sounds shorter than meaning that is unstressed, while the second syllable bove is longer or stressed. The next meter is trochaic, which is the reverse, long followed by a short. The example here is beauty. Bu is long and T is short. Next is pyrrhic, which is 2 unstressed syllables. Our example is when the or in the. Both phrases incorporate 2 monosyllabic words with short or unstressed sounds. Fourth, we have anapestic.
It could have been pesto here.
Yeah, it could have been... Hey, wait a minute.
I didn't mean nothing.
What am I? Some kind of plump domestic fowl here to amuse you? That's it! I'll give you a chicken. Here's your...
Anapestic involves 3 syllables, the first 2 being short and the last being long. Take the phrase, I must finish my journey alone. The syllables fin, jour, and lone are stressed while the 2 syllables coming before each of them are short. Fifth is dactylic, which has its root in the Greek word for finger.
I've got a finger for you, Trebek.
It is the pyrrhic's opposite, having 1 long syllable followed by 2 shorter syllables, like in the phrase, in his coat. That first word, or syllable, is long compared to the following 2. Finally, we jump back to the 2-syllable meter with spondaic, with both syllables being stressed, in the phrase, filthy mudblood, or boo-hoo. There are also different types of lyrical poems to sort through. There's the ode, which was discussed last month, but there are other forms as well, such as the elegy, a poem expressing sorrow or loss, often used for funerals. Then there's the sonnet, which is one of my personal favorites, and we'll talk about that one next month in detail. And of course, a monologue, where a single speaker addresses their poetry to a specific audience. There are also key elements that must be included in a lyrical poem. These elements include accessibility, brevity, emotionality, form, imagery and metaphor, musicality, spontaneity, and subjectivity. Starting with accessibility, you want your poem to be understood by a reader, any reader for that matter. There needs to be a context for why the poem exists. Don't use obscure language or make the subject matter too confusing. Brevity means that the poem is short and to the point. Haiku, for example, only have 3 lines and 17 syllables, while sonnets have 14 lines with 10 syllables each. Most lyrical poems are no longer than 60 lines. And this isn't some sweeping concerto, this is a quick song to evoke an emotional response in the moment. This is where emotionality comes into play. Lyrical poems often explore the internal intentions and intimations of the poet's heart. It is an opportunity for vulnerability from the poet and explicit trust in the reader to understand and sympathize with whatever that emotion might be. Next up, musicality. Lyrical poems are songs, remember? Even if you don't have any musical bone in your body, there is a part of you that connects with music and may draw inspiration from the songs and bands and genres that you listen to now. It doesn't mean you need to make your poem be accompanied by instrumentation, but it does mean your poem should be pleasing and enjoyable to read. This ties back to the topic of subjectivity. Write a poem that is going to appeal to you first and foremost, because the lyrics, lines, and rhymes are going to be yours. Spontaneity. This is a little harder to describe. Allow yourself to play with the words and emotions that you're using, and allow yourself to be surprised by what you write. Before you can let your readers see your vulnerability, be willing to be vulnerable with yourself. With that said, here are 5 tips for writing your lyrical poem. Tip number 1, study poetry. This sounds ridiculously obvious, but just hear me out. I've said it before and I'll say it again. Reading is breathing in while writing is breathing out. And if you want to be able to breathe out poetry, you need to read it and you need to study it. This isn't to copy or emulate style or word choices, but rather to immerse yourself in the content that you hope to add through your own writing. Tip number 2, be playful. Lyrical poetry relies on playfulness, which allows you to experiment with style and substance in your poetry. Play with words, with rhyming, and with the emotional elements and circumstances that you want to incorporate. These are the elements that can surprise you the most. So, allow yourself the room to experiment and have fun with what you're writing. Tip number 3, focus on personal experience. Your poetry is personal. You are the only authority on your emotions, your feelings, and your experiences. But why would anyone want to read about someone else's emotional experiences? But that is exactly what happens when we read poetry. We are getting this vulnerable, intimate insight into someone else's experiences. While your poetry should focus on your lived experiences and emotions, your poems will likely resonate with readers in ways that only they can connect with. Tip number 4, form and language develop together. Again, this goes back towards experimentation, specifically in how you structure your poem and the word choices affecting that poem. This means changing the kinds of stanzas you're building or where you break your lines with or without punctuation. This changes up the rhythm and the flow of words. Line lengths can also impact the poem as it's read out loud. And believe me, poetry is meant to be read out loud. And final tip, tip number 5, be spontaneous now and revise later. Don't worry about your first draft being perfect. It's not. Just put pen to paper, write something down, and let yourself cut loose. Let your feelings take over. When I've written poetry in the past, I usually did it when I was listening to music that fueled and reinforced the emotions I was dealing with, whether from a bad breakup or anger at some injustice or a friend's betrayal, whatever it was. I waited until after the poem was written before I took time to revise what I wrote. Get the feelings out of your head and onto paper. That way you get the emotional catharsis that you need, and then, and only then, once it's out of your head, go back with fresh eyes and make tweaks and changes as necessary. So that's it. That's the lesson on lyrical poetry. If you pay attention to all of the elements that need to be put in place and follow the 5 steps I've listed, then you'll be well on your way to creating something beautiful and heartfelt. Now, before I let you go, here's a challenge for you. Write a lyrical poem with rhyme, stressing the syllables, using the meter options discussed in this video. Once you have it written, post it in the video comments, or you can send it to me on Instagram or X at gkj_publishing, or you can email me a copy to gkjpublishing@gmail.com. I'd love to see what you come up with and offer feedback.